Hey, welcome to Brown Bag History for March 19th, 2025. Today we're talking about Revelstoke in the year 1900. As we begin, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Snacks homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and cultures. So last year was the 125th anniversary of the incorporation of the city of Revelstoke. It was incorporated on March 1st, 1899. And so we talked about that a lot last year. And next session, I'll be talking about the community of Farwell. So I won't go into a lot of detail today about sort of what preceded, the community as it was in 1900. But this was the first city council on April 4th, 1899, after their election. The first mayor was Florence McCarty, and the first alderman there. And when I show this to school classes, we look at that and I say, "What do you notice?" And of course, they notice the facial hair, and they notice that they're all wearing fancy clothes. And after a while, somebody will notice that they're all boys. So we talk about how women didn't have the vote until 1917. And we talk about how they're all British race as well. So we discussed that, fact that it was sort of one look, one perspective really representing council. There was a note from the newspaper on January 6, 1900, said the beautiful, beautiful snow is piling up steadily on the sidewalks, but the city council are too good and wise and great to allow a little thing like that to annoy them. So that was their way of saying that nobody was clearing the sidewalks. The city had its own police force. Then, right up until 1932, there was a city police force. We have one of the first the police record books in the archives, and it makes for interesting reading, I must say. And we also have the early tax rolls. The first tax roll of the city was 1900. So that's the first year that they registered all the properties in town and assessed taxes. On January 13th, 1900, the mayoral race was held, and A.N. Smith, who was a local baker, won over Frank McCarty, who was running for a second term. Back then, they had annual races in January for mayor and councillors. It was a close race. A.N. Smith had 102 votes and Frank McCarty 97. Another thing there was, I won't talk into a lot of detail right now, but one of the major industries in the region was mining. And a lot of the newspapers were full of mining news as well. Obviously the railway was a major employer, probably the major employer, but there was a lot of mining activity going on in the area as well, right through the Lardo area, the Big Bend area north of here, and also east into the Albert Canyon, Illecillewaet area. It was definitely a major industry in the region, driving a lot of people who are, the population growth and industry here. So this is a panorama photograph taken of Revelstoke, probably just before 1900 or right around 1899, 1900. So not a lot there. We're going to break that down into the three sections and then go through each section as we go through to see what was here in 1900. So at the left, there's that panorama was done in three specific sections. So on the section at the left, there's the CPR yards. You can't see the station there, but you can see the yards, some of the buildings, and the tracks. This with the smoke coming out of it was Revelstoke Sawmill, the Fred Robinson Sawmill Company, which we'll talk about a bit more. not a lot of houses. That's that whole area where sort of the downtown um, area of residences, and there's not a heck of a lot there yet. And not a lot happen. There's actually a water tower uh, there, and this is the back end of the um, Frank McCarty butcher store, which we'll look at a bit from the other side in a bit. So as I mentioned, the sawmill, it was Fred Robinson Lumber Company, and there was actually a note in the newspaper on February 27th, 1900, that Fred Robinson brought into town from his logging camp at the canyon the biggest sleigh load of logs that had ever come into town. It looked more like a load of hay. And it was actually at that time recorded as a prize load. You can see 8,250 feet. And you didn't see in that photograph, but on the hill behind the station was the CPR Hotel that was built by the railway company in 1897, at the time when they were building hotels all across the country, and some of which still exist, like the Banff and some of their big ones. But they had a lot of smaller hotels as well, including one in Glacier National Park, Glacier Lodge, which was removed in the 1920s. This one was also removed in the 1920s, especially after the First World War. They consolidated a lot of their smaller properties and closed some of the smaller ones. So this one was torn down in the 20s, but as you can see, quite a large fancy hotel there at one point. Um, just when I'm talking about 1900, the population from the 1901 census was around 1,800 people. So not a huge population, but it was still one of the largest centers in the interior of the province at that time. Kelowna and Nelson were also large communities, or sorry, not Kelowna, sorry, Kamloops. Kelowna was just a little farm town at the time, but Kamloops and Nelson and Revelstoke were the major centers in the interior. This was the CPR station. It was kind of like a what they call like a twin station. You can see there's two buildings there, and that was in use until 1905, when they built the brick station that a lot of people will remember, that was there until 1978. The when I was going to mention there, in 1899, the divisional point at Donald had been eliminated, leaving Revelstoke and Field as divisional points. Revelstoke was already a divisional point before that time, but when they eliminated the one at Donald, they moved a lot of the personnel and a lot of the jobs to Revelstoke. So there were a lot of there was an influx of CPR employees that came between 1899 and 1900. They even moved people's homes. They would dismantle them, move the logs by rail, and then rebuild the homes. And unfortunately, we don't have record of which homes those were, but I have people from just sort of stories passed down of people who've told me that their homes were Donald homes that were moved here. Sorry, I'm not sure. Yeah, yeah, that I'm not. That was they didn't move any graves. Yeah. No. Um, Also in 1900, there was a machinist strike in August, a 28 days long strike across the CP line in Canada. It was over a lot of the jobs had been eliminated, and so the workers had a strike over that. The strike finally ended inconclusively after 28 days, but many of the workers were rehired. This is the Frank McCarty butcher store, and you can see it also houses a drugstore on the left end that's McDowell, Atkins and Watson Company druggists, and on the other side is W.M. Lawrence. who ended up later built the hardware store which is now the Roxy Theater building. And you can see they also had cold storage and wholesale and retail butcher. And that was, again, the first mayor who had that business. That was on Track Street. There were a couple of other businesses on Track Street as well. The Bourne brothers had set up their general store there in 1900. They originally had this small building and then expanded to this second larger building. And they even had a public hall in the second floor there, known as Bourne's Hall. And then on this end was the Revelstoke Station Post Office. There were two post offices in Revelstoke, one on Front Street that was called Revelstoke Post Office, and then Revelstoke Station Post Office, located at Bourne Brothers store. And one of the Bourne brothers was the postmaster for the Revelstoke Station Post Office. The post offices merged in 1901 with one location. And there was the C.B. Hume. Their original store was also on Track Street in 1892. And he had bought the stock of his cousin J. Fred Hume, who had one of the first stores in the Farwell Town site in 1885. And then J. Fred Hume moved to Nelson. So if you've heard of the Hume Hotel, that's J. Fred Hume, who started his general store in Revelstoke, or actually in Farwell before it was Revelstoke. And then his cousin C.B. Hume bought his stock, local stock, and then had his business on Track Street, and then eventually built a big building where the Royal Bank is now in 1903. Now here's the second section of that photograph. And you can see here's Victoria Road and Mackenzie Avenue. And there were buildings built right out to the corners on both sides of the road. So where the parking lots are on both sides and the public washrooms on that side, there were businesses right out to the end. And those businesses were there until 1914 on this side when there was a fire and took down the end buildings. And then on the other side in 1916 when it took out the end buildings and they were never rebuilt. But you can see still there's not a heck of a lot happening there. There's the McCarty House there, which we'll look at a bit. There were several buildings in this first block on both sides, but not a lot beyond that yet. There's a little building here, which I believe was probably the where Malone's was most recently. There's an art gallery there now. And that was probably the Gallicano Bakery originally. Dominic Gallicano had a bakery there in 1899. But not a heck of a lot happening in the downtown area yet in this photograph. We can see here there's Campbell Avenue and the spur track, which is why Campbell Avenue is so wide, because there was a spur line that went down to the bank, and beyond where the riverbank is now, there was a smelter that slid into the river. But that's there was warehouses and coal sheds along there.
Sorry, what's a spur track?
Just sort of a small track coming from the original main line.
Oh.
Yeah. And then a few other things happening here. This is the Imperial, or the Imperial Bank of Canada, which is the building on the corner where the trading post is now. And next to it, you can just faintly see another building. That was the Union Hotel, which burned down in 1900. I and found a note from 1900 saying that Horace Manning opened his Palace of Sweets in the first block of Mackenzie Avenue and started making what was known as Broadway chocolates. And then he eventually had his building built on the next block up, the other, just down from City Hall in the next block from the City Hall of Manning's, which was opened in 1913, and they continued as a candy store until the 1950s, and then it became a, a Chinese restaurant, and it was a Chinese restaurant until just a couple of years ago. Um, so you can't quite see Mount Begbie in this photograph, but Mount Begbie was the name was officially adopted in on June 30th, 1900, but it shows up in a map as early as 1890. So it was being referred to as Mount Begbie before then, but was officially gazetted in 1900. Can't quite see it in, yeah, probably is not quite there yet, but also the Selkirk Hall, which was on 2nd Street East for years, was moved there. Uh, the building had been brought over from Donald and was built there in 1900 as the Oddfellows Lodge. Um, so here's a photograph taken from the other direction, looking towards Mount Revelstoke, which you can see has no trees on it. There was a fire, and we know that there was a fire on the mountain in 1892. Whether there was a later one or not, we're not sure. But you can see that there's really nothing, really not much vegetation on Mount Revelstoke at that time. And the other thing that you'll notice here is a spire. That was a Catholic church. It was built at the corner where the Royal Bank is now in 1893. And it was moved in 1900 up the street. And I'll show you that location in a sec. And you can see a few other buildings that we'll look at in a little closer detail here. This is the Taylor Block and the original Molson's Bank. It was built there in 1898. So this is a photograph that was taken at the same time as the one that we just looked at, but it's in quite rough shape. Somebody looks like they put their coffee cup down on, there's a nice coffee ring there. And somebody actually even wrote, penciled or wrote in pen over it as well. So it's in kind of rough shape, but you can see at that corner of First and Mackenzie, there's the Catholic Church. And then there's a house on there. And when they were originally building on that street, there were houses, several houses built on the street until it was pretty much was determined it was going to be the main downtown street. So the houses were moved. And this particular house was the Bourne brothers, one of the Bourne brothers' homes. And you can see them a bit closer there, the Catholic Church and the Bourne house. And the Bourne house was later moved to the 600 block in the middle of the block. And then later still, it was moved around the corner of 6th Street and is still there now and was added on to. That's the one house we've been able to find that was moved twice. A lot of houses were moved once, but that one actually got moved twice. And there's where the Catholic Church was moved to. That's where the Catholic Hall is now. This church was there until about 1982 when it was torn down to make way for the current hall, church hall. And I think they added on the side wings when they moved it up. But they moved buildings here all the time. It was a very common thing to do. So the church was just moved up to the corner. This was on that photograph looking down, this was the building that you could see on the corner of Victoria and Mackenzie. And it was called the Canada Drug and Book Store. And I remember reading an article about somebody who'd said that whenever the train would go by, the whole store would shake, and sometimes the books would actually fall off the shelves. And somebody referred to it as the Canada Drunken Bookstore because of all the shaking that was going on there. That one burned down in 1914. The druggist who came, C.R. McDonald, later built the drugstore where the Taco Club is now, but that was a little later on than what we're talking about today. This was the original Molson's Bank. It was built at that location in 1898, and it was later moved up the street when they built the bank or the building that's on that corner now. And if you look on the front of the building that's there now, it actually, unless they covered it up recently, it actually still said Molson's Bank. I think it's sort of a discovery center for the RMR at this point. But this building was moved down the street and became Moll's Pool Hall, which a couple of you in the building would probably still remember. And, and this was the interior of the upper suite in the Molson's Bank. It was J.D. Molson and his wife who lived up there. He was a member of the Molson family, and it was the Molson family that started the bank. And, you know, if you recognize the name Molson, it was the same family that had the brewing company, but they had a bank from the mid 1850s until the 1920s when it was taken over by Bank of Montreal. This was the suite of Mr. and Mrs. Molson. The Taylor Block, built by T.E.L. Taylor, who's a local citizen. And that'd be approximately where the Chubby Fensters, or I think it's now called Chesterfield, but where that building is now. And because this one burned down in 1916 as well. And they had a furniture store on the one end and a drugstore on the other side. And you can see there's a home there too. I'm not sure where that one got moved to, but looks actually a couple of homes there that would have been moved out to make way for more business buildings. This was approximately where City Furniture is now, but closer to Victoria Road. It was Robert Tapping who built a couple of public buildings here. He built the theater building where some of the first motion pictures shown in town were shown. And then he later built the Opera House, which is on the corner where where Mountain View School used to be, right on the corner on that block. The House and Furniture, their original store was in the 100 block of Mackenzie Avenue, and they later built what was the House and Block, which includes Whereabouts and the other there. So the House and Furniture store moved to the location of that block where Whereabouts is now. This building later burned down in the 1916 fire. There was the Fire Brigade number 2. There were 2 fire brigades because of that separation between Lower Town and Upper Town. And the 2nd Brigade was formed in 1898. And they had their fire hall built behind what became the City Hall building on 2nd Street. And then when they built the current City Hall, the fire station was built right into the current City Hall. And, you know, they moved that out. There's offices in there now. But that's why they have the tower on the City Hall building. That was the fire hose tower. This was the home of Frank McCarty, and we could see in that photograph, you could actually see it in that photograph. It was started in 1899 and completed in 1900. There was a note in the newspaper on October 12th, 1900, and talking about the house, it said, "It takes the lead for solid workmanship, comfort, and elegance of design. On the 2nd floor, there were 5 large bedrooms and a bathroom. And the woodwork was cedar and fir. The contractor was John Kernahan, who was a local builder. And the stone cellar, which was 2 feet thick, was done by E.C. Fromey, who's a local brick and stone mason. And this was on the block. This building is just across from where the Catholic Hall is now. And it was the home of G.S. McCarter. And it was also built between 1899 and 1900. So those were 2 of the really early homes that were built on Mackenzie Avenue. The Imperial Bank, as I mentioned, it was built where the trading post is now on the corner, and actually the building is still there underneath. If you go farther down the street and look up, you can actually see some of that original roof line in there. Across the street from it, where Home Hardware is now, there was the first Union Hotel built by H.A. Brown, and it was built in 1891. So the first hotel in the upper part of town, and it was destroyed by fire at the end of January in 1900. Was quite a spectacular fire. The newspaper said the basement of the hotel was filled with flames, and the guests at dinner in the house discovered smoke coming up through the floor of the dining room. Number 2 fire brigade was soon on the scene, and number 1 was notified, and but for a few minutes delay in waiting for a team would have arrived sooner. But the building couldn't be saved, so they were working on trying to save the surrounding buildings as well, which they managed to do. There was actually where the Remax building is, there was an old hotel there called the Hotel Edwards, which was kind of dilapidated, but the flames did jump to there, but they managed to get them out. Said shortly before the walls collapsed, the flames reached to an enormous height, lighting up the dark mountain sides for many miles around. At 8 o'clock in the morning, it was all over, and there was nothing left of the Union but a few heaps of smoldering timbers. And though across where the Remax is now, um, uh, the there was a man named Ed Corning who had just taken over the lease for the Union Hotel. And then when it burned down, he took over the old Edwards property and built what was known as the Climax Hotel. And we have stories about that one, including a murder that happened there that they were never able to charge anyone because of the murky circumstances. But anyway, that one burned down in 1916. You hear me talking about buildings burning down a lot. It was a very frequent occurrence. And the this was the second Union Hotel. So H.A. Brown, when his first one burned down, built this one. And that is where Pam's Kitchen is now. This one burned down in the 1930s. It was believed to be an arson fire, and two men died in that fire. So this is the third part of that panorama photograph. And you can see Government Road, which eventually was extended all the way up to what is now Victoria Road. And when you're at Lord Co Auto Parts and Terra Vita Kitchen, there's that angled road. That's the last vestige of Government Road. It angled all the way through to the what was the school property right to 3rd Street. And it was seen as a quicker route to get from the businesses on Front Street up to the station. That's what it was originally built for, when the people at the station were complaining that there it wasn't easy for them to get their goods from the station down to their stores. There's a building here that's City Hotel, which is where Canyon Industrial Electric is now. And there's the Tappings Opera House. And you can just barely, there's a building here that was the schoolhouse and the Anglican church in here. It's hard to see sort of what's happening down in Lower Town, but we'll look at that a little bit later. And again, you can see the burnt off hillside there, the base of Mount Revelstoke. So there's another picture. This would be from 1900, May of 1900. So a couple of changes there. You can still see Campbell Avenue, but now there's a rink there. And the rink was built in 1900, or was opened. It was started in 1899 and opened in 1900. The first curling match there was held in February of 1900. So they had the curling rinks in there as well as ice for hockey and skating. And again, you can see the Opera House in there and Government Road. And a few more houses starting to be built up in between. At that time, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Street were named James, John, and George Street. And those names were changed in 1900. Oh, so 1st Street was John, 2nd Street was James, 3rd Street was George, and I don't know who they were. We at one point thought that it was like names of kings, but then we've got Douglas as well. So Douglas, there was no King Douglas, although there was the first governor of the Crown Colony of BC was James Douglas. So, but we don't know for sure where those names came from. And yeah, so there's the photograph of the City Hotel that opened in 1899 and burned down in 1913, probably again an arson fire, and there was one person died in that fire. There's the St. Peter's Anglican Church. The church was built in 1896, and the The bell was brought over and installed in um, January 1900. They were built the tower there for the new bell. So that was the addition to the church in 1900. And then the rectory was added on to over the next few years as well. This was the public school. That building opened in 1891, I think, with just two classrooms. And you can see by 1899, it's bursting at the seams, and they were actually had some other small buildings where they were housing extra classes, kind of like portables, but actually they just threw up quick buildings on the side to uh, to ease the crowding in the school. But that was partly due to the movement of families from the old divisional point of Donald. It kind of swelled the population. And in this photograph, there's 5 teachers and 200 students, so about 40 kids per teacher there. And this is the Cowan block on the corner of 3rd and Charles. It's kind of a pinkish apartment building there now, but it was built by William Cowan, who's a local entrepreneur, and in the 1890s for his telephone office, because he started the first telephone company in Revelstoke. And that was the office there. And right across from there, there's a house there now, probably built in the 20s or so. But there had been an earlier house on that property, and that one was moved up to Mackenzie Avenue in 1900 by a woman named Mrs. Lawson. And she had that as her store. She was selling women's and children's clothing and laces and embroideries. And that's what is now Modern Bake Shop. It was actually moved from the just right across the street from the Cowan block in 1900. That's why it looks like a house, because it was a house. And Enterprise Brewery was built by local entrepreneurs Thomas Downs, Charles Holton, and William Cowan, the fellow who had the telephone company. He had his fingers in a lot of pies. They built that there in 1897, and it was in operation until the 1950s. And the courthouse, well, this was the original courthouse, quite a pretty building itself. It was built there in 1897 on the same lot as the current courthouse. So, but by 1912, when they built the current one, Revelstoke was really, as I said, one of the important cities in the interior, and they thought that it needed a better courthouse building. This one, even though it wasn't that old, was getting kind of dilapidated. So they removed it and built the courthouse that's there now. Um, One of the things that I came across in the newspaper at that time was a note saying that the inmates of the houses of ill fame at the West End were summoned before H.N. Corsier magistrate on Thursday and fined $10 or $5 apiece in costs. So what they mean by the inmates of the houses of ill fame were sex workers on at the brothels, and there were brothels on Douglas Street and Front Street. And in fact, I remember going through the police records and finding about 50 different names of women who were charged for sex work in that year, and it actually increased over the next few years. They were segregated as well. They were only allowed to come up to town on certain days, and they had to be accompanied. And so it was definitely part of most frontier towns in the province back then. It was a tax grab, yeah, because the city was actually, as I said, it said there they were charging them $10 or $5 a piece in costs. And that would probably be $10 would probably be the equivalent of several hundred now. And because the average wage for a working man in 1900 would have been about, if doing good, he had a good job, it'd be about $1,200 a year maximum, salary for most working men. So $10 was pretty significant. And the difference between $10 and $5 would be whether the woman was called the keeper of the house, or the madam as the terminology was then, or the inmate. or the sex worker who was working for the woman who owned the house or ran it. This is the Sibbald House, which is still there. It was built in 1897. J.D. Sibbald was a local magistrate and involved in various levels of government. There's actually Sibbald Road near near close to Downey Street in that area, named after him. And then the Holton House, which everybody knows well, still there and still looking pretty much as it did. There was a major restoration done of the house in the about around 1990 or so, and that was the home of Charles Holton, who came here in 1885 and did really well in mining in the Lardo. He was one of the first, they had one of the first successful claims in the Lardo region, the Silver Cup, which is still an active mine now. And they made quite a bit of money on the sales of that. So he moved into town, had this house built for his bride, Lida Silcott, and said he was involved in the Enterprise Brewery as well. So again, had fingers in several pies. There was a lot of steamboat activity on the river at that time. Some of the boats did come up to Revelstoke. This was the Columbia and Lytton, and the dock was near the south end of Front Street. This picture would be from about 1895. And they also had a dock close to where the boat launch is now in Centennial Park, sort of in that area as well. But the first one was at Front Street. These boats were actually built in Revelstoke. At that time, there was a branch line between Revelstoke and Arrowhead, and then there was some of the bigger steamers would operate on the upper and lower Arrow Lakes between Arrowhead and West Robson, which is now where Castlegar is. The Minto is probably the most famous of the and long operating of the boats on the river. This was the first private hospital. The house is still there. It was opened as a hospital by local doctors, McKechnie and Jeffs, in 1897, and they ran it until 1902 when the Queen Victoria Cottage Hospital opened in where the Save on Foods location is now. And there's Front Street Hill, or sorry, Douglas Street Hill, sort of coming down to the lower part of town. You can see again, the hospital building right there, and then the Wells House at the top of the hill. And even actually, there was a little bit of a gully there, and actually had a little bridge built over the gully. And I believe this was sort of blacksmith shops at the bottom of the hill there. And this is a very early photograph taken from the courthouse hill, looking down over Farwell. You can see what was known as the Needham building isn't there yet, but this house is still there at the bottom of the hill. So this is looking down into sort of the original Farwell town site in the front, which was mostly centered on Front Street. So it's quite an early photograph of that area. And then what's now locally known as the Needham building was actually built by a J.R. Hall Meat Market on Douglas Street. And they have established 1883, but they weren't in Revelstoke at that time. They were I believe, in Kamloops originally. And this building was built probably in the early 1890s, and then was later bought by the Needhams as their Needhams Building Supplies, and is now Alchemy Studio. And all the cattle on the road there.
A cowboy.
Yeah, cowboy is there. Occasionally, we'd come across these notes in the newspaper where they'd bring cattle into town on the train, and one would escape and go off into the hills. There was one note where they finally captured a couple after they'd been on the loose for quite a while, and they were pretty wild by that point. This was the first fire brigade that opened in Lower Town or Front Street in 1892, and then they had a fire hall down there. So there were two fire halls, two fire brigades, and they didn't merge until 1922. And Sam Needham had been the the chief of #1 Fire Brigade, and he took over as fire chief until until he retired, I believe in the 1950s, and passed it to his son, Sam Needham Jr. There was actually three Sam Needhams, but that's a whole other story. Once the Second Fire Brigade was formed, they used to have annual competitions, and this was their first competition that they held on Front Street in May of 1898. And I mean, it's interesting because of the fellows running down the street there and all the bystanders. But it's also interesting to see, how built up Front Street is by that time. Because that was the major downtown center at the time before the businesses started to move up to Mackenzie and before this became the downtown. But so Revelstoke essentially had two downtowns for an overlapping period of several years. This building right there is H.N. Corsair General Merchant. And there's the Victoria Hotel at the end of the street. And so there's, quite a few businesses operating there. There was also several Chinese businesses on the street as well. Bit of a small Chinatown area on downtown. This is the man in front of the buildings on one of the buildings on Front Street. This man is F.B. Wells. He came here. He was actually one of the first postmasters for the Revelstoke post office, and he had a men's clothing store. And it's a very rare photograph of a store interior, but it's showing the interior of his clothing store. He operated or he bought and sold furs from trappers as well. And you'll notice downstairs we've got a big fur press that was built for his store in about 1912 or 1911 or so. This is a very unusual photograph, one of a series of photographs of a Chinese funeral procession on Front Street, probably 1898 or 1890. And I think early 1898, there was a man named Mark Singh, who had been a businessman, Chinese businessman in town. And he was a prominent member of the Chi Kung Tong, which was equivalent to the Chinese Freemason Society. So they had the Freemasons or their Tong ceremonial funeral procession for him. And it was described in great detail in the newspaper at the time. So this is a really unusual photograph from the collection of the Molson family. So I showed you the photograph of their little apartment in the bank building. And says Mrs. J.C. Molson and acquaintance. And that little building was identified as his house. And I think that was probably in what's sort of the other side of the highway, sort of in the Columbia Park area. And there were several what were referred to as shacks owned by Chinese people in that area. And the public health officer actually ordered them burned down in the fall of 1899. So this building was probably gone by 1900. But it's a very unusual photograph having, the banker's wife having a photograph taken with a Chinese man living in a shack there. But yeah, there was a lot of prejudice and racial racism against the Chinese population. And at the time, there was probably about 1/6 of the population was Chinese. There was a note in the newspaper on May 26th, 1900, an election campaign ad by Alex McCrae, who was running for the Revelstoke riding of the West Kootenay for the provincial election. And he said, regarding Asiatic immigration, I am in uncompromising opposition to it and will assist in every legitimate way to stem its tide and discourage its competition with white labor. So that was definitely, the feeling of the day. This is the Central Hotel, which was on Front Street. It was torn down in the probably early 1920s. It had been in operation by the Abrahamson family as early as 1885. They came here. They were following railway construction across and ended up building a hotel here. Their first hotel was a tent when they first got here in 1885, and then they ended up by 1908 with this big building. They rebuilt it a couple of times, and but during the Prohibition that was brought into effect in 1917, a lot of the hotels uh, really couldn't operate because they were making a lot more money on liquor sales than they were on renting rooms. And so several of the hotels went under, and the Central was one of those. I did find a note after Prohibition was brought in that one of the Abrahamsons was charged with illegal liquor sales because they were probably trying to see what they could get away with, but they were actually really clamping down on it. And so that sort of was a death knell for some of the local hotels, including the Central. There was also the Oriental Hotel, which became as big as the Central. This was sort of their second iteration. And again, they started out just as just a really rough frame building. And in their first ads, it says that the upper floor was a ram pasture. And basically that was where men could unroll their bed kit, their sleeping bag, and sleep on a floor. That was referred to as a ram pasture. But they ended up with a 3-story hotel as well. That was the Stone family, originally Stromdahl. Again, a family came from Sweden and again followed railway construction across. And the Victoria Hotel, farther down on the street, closer to the bridge, was opened by William Cowan in 1885. So again, one of the early hotels. And you've heard me mention William Cowan a couple of times, and he also started the Revelstoke Water, Light and Power Company and the telephone company, and was one of the original partners in the brewery. So this is the dam, on the first dam on the Yellow Silhouette. They later built a structure across it as well, but this was one of its early versions of the dam. And it was originally built in 1898. So it was one of the very earliest dams on the river system in the whole West Kootenay. And that was opened by the Revelstoke Water, Light and Power Company, which was started by William Cowan. And they also built the first water system in town. And then the company was purchased by the city in 1902. So they took that over. They actually started discussions to take it over right from 1899, but took until 1902 to finish all the paperwork and sign it over to the city. So one of the things that was in like every issue of the newspaper in the very early days was the Boer War. And in fact, they would even have, when there were major victories for the British, they would even have ceremonies in town and involve all the school kids and close schools and have big celebrations when there were major wins by the British. And they were recruiting in town. I believe this group was from the Second Boer War in 1902, but in 1900 they were recruiting, and they had 10 men who were selected and approved by the local doctor to join the Strathcona Horse unit to go to South Africa for the Boer War. At that time, there had been a group of Revelstoke rifles in Revelstoke from the earlier in the late 1890s, and then in the beginning of January 1900, they became the Rocky Mountain Rangers, and Revelstoke was one of the units of the Rocky Mountain Rangers, which was based out of Kamloops. There was a note in the newspaper at the time that Mrs. Wilkes was opening a kindergarten class, and kindergarten wasn't in the schools at that time. So this was actually something that the parents would pay for their children to attend. And they opened in March 12th, 1900. And we have the names for most of the children there. This one is Shella Dickey. And at that time, her family would have been living right here. This is where the Dickey house was built until it was moved to make way for the post office. And then members at the Field and Tomlinson family, which were in town for many years. And this poor little child was made to wear this fancy collar and cuffs. Charles Field. Just talk briefly about, there was a lot of agriculture that was going on in the area. There were ranches at Williamson's Lake. The Williamson, Alfred Williamson had a ranch there. That's where the name of the lake comes from. There was farms on sort of all around the area as well. The Hay family had a farm in Arrow Heights, so Hay Road is not named after the crop, it's named after the Hay family who had a farm there. One of their big crops was strawberries, which a lot of the farmers did. Some of the Italian settlers were starting to settle in the South Side area and in Arrow Heights. The Fraser family had a farm in Big Eddy, and there were other farms in that area as well. There were farms in Columbia Park. The Maley family had they had a florist business, so they had a greenhouse and orchards on the Big Bend Road, and operated that for many years. So there was a lot of agriculture happening in the area. So I'm just going to show, to end off, show some of the sports clubs because there was a lot going on, recreationally in town as well. So the cricket club was formed in 1892, and they had grounds be close to sort of where the Ramada Inn and that area is up now, close to the mountain, base of the mountain. The Revelstoke hockey team was formed in 1898. The first recreational ski club was formed in probably about 1891, but I really talk about the competitive ski club that really got into like the tournaments and the ski jumping. That wasn't formed until 1914, but there was recreational skiing going on there. And then I want to throw in this one as well, which is the Albert Canyon Ski Club in 1899. There are a lot of characters living in there. And one of them, I'm not sure which one he is in this photograph, but Ole Sandberg was the person who was credited with introducing skiing to Revelstoke when he skied from his claims in Albert Canyon into Revelstoke one day on what the locals called Norwegian snowshoes. And he actually challenged the champion of the Rossland Ski Club to do a run from Albert Canyon from 2.5 miles to any distance he may require in return, and was hoping to do a bet. I don't know whether that ever happened or not, but he was so there was skiing going on by then in a big way. There was a snowshoe club. The Jordan Snowshoe Club had been formed in 1890, and they would go up as far as the Jordan River on treks. The Gun Club was, which later became the Rod Gun Club, was formed in May of 1894, and they had their first location near the cricket field, and they would have regular shoots. The Tennis Club was formed in 1894, and they had court at the base of Douglas Street Hill, down at the bottom of the hill there. The first baseball clubs were formed in 1897. The first football or soccer club was formed in 1895. They had on the sports day on the Queen's birthday, so it would be May of 1900. They had a football game between Lardo versus Revelstoke. It said, a large crowd assembled to see the struggle for victory between our neighbors to the south and our town boys. This being the third year of their meeting, Revelstoke had the best of the game from the start and kept the ball close to their opponent's goal throughout, scoring 1 goal in the first half and 4 in the latter. And then there was also a bicycle club, which was formed in 1899, and they had bicycle races quite often in town as well. Eddie Edwards was the local racing champion. They've even got Mary Edwards here, who later became Mary Hamilton, in a sort of a tricycle contraption. So that's I could go on, but that's about enough today for what Revelstoke was like in 1900. Our next brown bag history is Wednesday, April 2nd, and we'll be talking about the Farwell settlement, which is 140 years old this year. And also wanted to mention that we're taking part in an exhibit at the Revelstoke Visual Arts Center with a Gallery 3 show of paintings of Sophie Atkinson, who was a noted painter who settled in Revelstoke for several years. And that opens on Thursday, March 27th. So thank you very much for coming.